Hello, everyone, and welcome to the March 17th, 2022 edition of Groundwater Talk Live. I'm Tom Ballard, the groundwater guy, and our topics today is we're going to catch up on some groundwater news. So I'm offering up some pithy comments on the current groundwater news. I've selected a few stories to talk about, or some themes through here, and a few news stories per theme. And then some miscellaneous topics that I thought might be of interest to you folks in the water resources industry out there. So before we get going here, let me just adjust everything and if you can drop a comment in the chat, let me know you're there as we go along. If you have any comments as we talk about some of this stuff, your opinions on this, let me know, and I'm more than happy to discuss those in a little more free form. I like to do this every now and then, catch up on the water news. I probably need to do it more often, but it's just good to see what's going on out there in the industry because a lot of people watching this are water system operators, and they it's just good to hear what's going on in the industry. So make our appropriate adjustments here. So. Um, so today we're going to cover. There's a few themes I wanted to look at. One is the first one is monitoring COVID in wastewater, using wastewater to monitor COVID, and I'm not so much interested in COVID per se. I think it's a little overwrought, and but it is the technique is interesting and it can have applications in the future. Obviously, this has been used for a while for things like polio and tracking some of these things, but they've really kind of stepped it up with COVID and the whole panic there. And my pithy commentary there is I do think COVID is a little overwrought, and I say that from the standpoint of having had it twice and gone through that. And I'm somebody I've had two heart attacks, a stroke. I got some other what they call comorbidities. So and I'm still kicking here. Some people may say I'm too ornery to die, but that's that's really so. I think it's a little overwrought, but what the important point is not so much that because there's a lot of controversy on COVID. The important thing is using the wastewater as a tool to monitor some of these outbreaks and especially people that are asymptomatic for certain things. It kind of gives you an average of what's going on in the community, and so I think it's an interesting technique that we're going to see a lot more of. There are some pros and cons to this that we'll kind of get into in some of these stories we're going to look at, and some conflicting information, and so it's not without its weaknesses, but it is an interesting technique to kind of monitor how these things ebbs and flows. So in the future, I think you're going to see this a lot more when we have outbreaks. Hopefully it will not be the panicky stuff we've seen with COVID. And it's a little more systematic and scientific, and so let's kind of dive in. But before we get into that, I do have a good news story I wanted to share first, and then we'll dive into the COVID wastewater and then some of our other stories here. So our first story up is let me fix that on the monitor here as I go through these things. Yeah, so this is really this is a good news story to start off with. Is USDA is going to that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who's a big funder of rural water programs. They are they have a lot of grant and loan programs out there, and so this is super. I have some commentary on this. This is good news. They've anteed up 166.5 million in water infrastructure projects, and so that's kind of through the infrastructure program that Congress passed and was signed into law. So the infrastructure law, it's going to benefit 108 projects, and that's those funds are coming through the USDA. So good program there. Let's look at some of these projects here. There's the usual patting ourselves on the back on these things like government agencies are wont to do, but um, But we get into the details here, and there's really some different areas that they're looking at watershed programs for this. They provided 918 million. There's an initial 166 million that went out on this for watershed programs. So that's the watershed flood prevention operations, or WFPO, watershed rehabilitation program, acronym REHAB, and emergency watershed protection EWP program. So those are, these. The first one is the rehab program, focusing on repairing existing infrastructure. There's a couple examples here: Athens, Ohio, and Anasco, Puerto Rico. These are dam projects. Since these are watershed projects, these are dam projects. And while I think dam projects are important, and obviously you don't want dams failing, there's a real danger in that. We want to maintain those things. My commentary is, there does not seem to be a real focus on uh, going back and rehabbing existing infrastructure. I know dams are a little more sexy, but rusting pipes in distribution systems is actually a lot more important. So that some of that asset management stuff is, we have a lot of distribution systems and valves and things that need to be replaced in water systems throughout this country. And that doesn't get the news and does not percolate to the top of the pile quite as much. Now, there is some funding that goes to that, and USDA is actually good about that through some of their grant programs. And I will say that USDA is really one of the best. We really prefer them over some of the state programs, for instance. But I think that the existing infrastructure, as far as pipes, distribution systems, water storage like tanks, does not get the attention that it really deserves. And we have a lot of aging infrastructure in this country, and this has been my common theme that we really need to get at. And so I think it's important that we start looking at more funding for that. But but it doesn't read as well as you're rehabbing a dam, as opposed to, well, we're going out and replacing these ancient valves that are rusted shut and are leaking. It's that just doesn't make quite the press release, but it's hugely important to, especially to small water districts. The other thing that these things are focused on is, and there's some new infrastructure in here that's important. We need to keep, as our population grows, we need to keep building out new infrastructure, and so that's important. But once again, I think the existing infrastructure in terms of distribution lines, valves, tanks, those types of assets really get short shrift on things, and I'd really like to see more done there. So there's my pithy commentary on that. The other point is a lot of this money goes towards disadvantaged communities, and while I understand that, and I think it's important, because disadvantaged communities are less likely to be able to afford things in their water systems. The rates probably aren't high enough to really invest in capital improvement programs, so they're less able to afford things. There seems to be a real lack of any significant grants or any focus on getting money other than loans to these medium-sized districts. Now, big water districts, they're probably a little bit better funded, but we got this gap in here that these small disadvantaged communities, their water districts, obviously are in need of funds, and they're really hand to mouth. And then we have our larger water districts that are probably fairly well funded, and so they can tolerate taking on loans and what they need. But in between, we have these small to medium-sized water districts that may not be in a disadvantaged community, but they really aren't big enough and they don't have the funds necessary to do what they need to do. So once again, as I talk to people, I see a real gap in these funding programs for some of these systems that fall within that gap in between the small disadvantaged communities and the bigger systems that are a little bit better funded. Now, these days, nobody is really well funded, but the bigger water systems tend to be, have actual capital improvement programs and have the funds available at least to be able to carry the costs of doing loans rather than grants. But a lot of these mid-sized districts, they may not be able to take on the loan payments. So what do? And they put off maintenance, and then that only makes things work. So we see kind of a cascading effect out there when we talk to these guys that they don't have the funds to do it. And so the can keeps getting kicked down the road, and then you start getting into that mode where you're doing emergency repairs, and that gets more expensive too, and it becomes kind of a quagmire that is difficult to get out of. So I'd like to see some more funding available for people like that. Maybe have a really low interest loan, not quite a grant, but not the low interest, the so-called low interest loans that people need to pay back, or some extended payment terms, something to be done for these mid-sized districts. And they seem to be in kind of that gray area that gets ignored. So so with that's my commentary on that. It's good news that this money is getting out there, and that we're seeing some of these funds expended for our infrastructure. But just want to let you know there's that gap there, and we're really not looking at some of the not sexy things that really need to be done. So that's my commentary on that. So let's get into into the wastewater monitoring a little bit and I got I think like 5 stories here that all make a little bit different points, and I wanted to comment on those a little bit. Grab a drink of water here. So first headline here is CDC wants to monitor poop. States aren't all on board. So this is the wastewater monitoring. So obviously, if you're going to do national level monitoring to track these things on a national basis, then you're going to want to have a lot of sites around the country. Now, not all states are on board here. But it is a process. It's not like just going out and dipping a stick in the wastewater and running a test. There are some caveats to doing that, and interpreting the results can be a little challenging too. So that's one thing here too. So it says here that California, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania only have clusters of collection sites up and running, primarily in major population centers. So you're getting a little bit of a sample bias there. Minnesota and New Jersey are not even sure of how large their programs will be. And North Dakota and Wyoming don't plan to participate. So we definitely have some gaps in this. We're going to have some improvements if this is going to be one technique. It helps to identify, and I was kind of surprised when I started looking into this, because obviously this technique has been around for a while, but really with COVID is really where it really started gaining traction. So it can really help pick up on trends. What you're getting is, by analyzing the wastewater, you're not analyzing particular individuals. You're able to pick up both asymptotic and symptomatic people at the same time. So you're looking at the community average, for instance, and that can be instructive as these viruses show up in the wastewater. You can see them ebb and flow, and you can actually track outbreaks this way. Now, like I say, there's some caveats to the sampling and how accurate it is, and some of the complexities to it. But overall, if it's systematically done and there's not bias for larger communities versus smaller communities, then it can be useful. But like this article says, not everybody is on board with this. So there are some data gaps. So what we're getting from this sampling process really is something that we need to take with a little bit of grain of salt, just well, understand the sampling bias. Anytime you're doing statistics, of course, you're going to get some type of bias that's built in, because you're never going to have homogeneous data collection. That's just not in the cards a lot of times. So we try to, you know, execute some statistical techniques to kind of smooth that data and spread it across the larger populations. But just know the background data, there are some challenges to that as well. So anyway, it's you know, they say here the Lumen Ultra is a private commercial lab that's assisting states in this program. They're saying that it's not a sustainable strategy. It's just, you know, it gets expensive, and so you can't monitor for this stuff all the time. I think over time, as they look at this, they may improve it. It may become more automated. But when we have a potential outbreak, then people start monitoring, and it's just something that they don't think is sustainable right now, based on the techniques and how they do it. So, and as they mentioned, they're hoping to build a system that's a little more automated and can track these things over time. You have to know what you're looking for too. I mean, obviously, if it's an unknown virus that nobody's looking for, then this method isn't going to pick it up. So there's only a dozen states right now that are in this program. It lists them here, that are routinely submitting. So you're seeing bias. We can kind of look and see California, Colorado, Illinois, Missouri, North Carolina, New York, Ohio, Rhode Island, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Wisconsin. So Southeast, not well represented. The middle of the country, the Midwest, not very well represented. And basically the northwestern U.S. not really well represented here either. So some pretty big gaps in there of where you're sampling in the country. So it's really data you got to take with a grain of salt. So now CDC thinks that they can make do with the data they have, and that's all well and good. You just need to understand what the data gaps are, and the problem I have with letting this information out is it comes out, it gets generalized, and you gotta, anytime you look at these news stories, you gotta understand where the data gaps are and how they affect the actual presentation of the data. So anyway, they're looking at boosting data. This kind of goes on and talks about that, and they want to build on this from here, which I think this has, you know, some potential down the road for looking at other trends, as long as we're not, you know, getting overwrought like we did on COVID. But anyway, so next story here. You know, everybody likes to make their interesting headlines to make them pop a little bit. So, scoop in your poop: how DC and Virginia plan to use wastewater to track COVID spread. This kind of covers some of the same things, but it's specifically focused on District of Columbia and Virginia. They're planning to ramp up their COVID-19 wastewater surveillance, and so. So it's you know, so they're planning to actually match it up against the testing that's done for people, and I think that the problem with that is you get some sample bias there. Some people are inclined to get tested, others aren't. Wastewater is kind of testing the community in general, so you know, the people that might be inclined to get tested, maybe the people that are symptomatic. So you can see how some sample bias enters in here, and so it makes the data, uh, you know, can be a little questionable in places, or at least you need to understand what the sample biases are once again. and interpret it in light of those sample biases. So, but they're working to work with this. They're working with CDC to implement these wastewater testing. So we are seeing, maybe some of these data gaps are getting filled in here as more states go in this direction. I think it needs to be a little bit more systematic if you're going to make it work, and really focus on pulling some people in to do this testing that are going to give you representative data from specific areas in the country and the country as a whole, and not just selected areas based on whether they choose to participate or not. Now, now this is where, and I got two stories right in a row here that show some of the sample bias here. So here we have an article that says CDC sewer data suggests bump in US COVID-19 cases. So here's our panic again. This is from yesterday, March 16th. And so they're seeing that a third of the wastewater sampling sites in the U.S. are showing an uptick in COVID-19 cases as we move into spring here. And so are we going to go into more COVID panic or not with this? So that's some of the data from nationwide sites. So 145 wastewater sampling sites out of 401 active sites revealed an increase of 10% or more coronavirus in the wastewater levels. So they're seeing an uptick here. Now, that's that. Now, now we go to something like Maine, and they're saying, okay, we're seeing a 98 and 97% decline since early January. So you can see how some of these, and I'm kind of focusing on the headlines here, but we can see how the sample bias really enters into things. So you need to really dive into the details to understand what this data means. So we have directly conflicting evidence of a nationwide sampling that shows an uptick, but here we are in Maine and we're showing a steep decline. So if you have your samples are collected from areas that are showing a steep decline, and you are now looking at comparing that at the national, you go, what's up with that? So clearly there's some areas that are biasing the CDC data. And so you need to dive deeper into the details. So you read one article and do you take that at face value or not? So that's let me just check in real quick here, and yeah, Dirk is saying, yeah, it seems a far cry from being practical. It is. I think we're in the early stages of really of really this being incredibly useful. And like I say, take the data with a grain of salt. Understand the flaws in the data collection, the data gaps, and the sample bias. And don't just take the news media. The news media likes reporting dramatic headlines for one thing. So either steep decline, like we're seeing in this article, or there's an uptick. That makes news. They can write headlines about that, and the devil is in the details as always. So you really got to look at the data behind it. I think this is going to improve over time as they do it. But I got an article that I got coming up here that really talks about some of the problems here in collecting this data and how it's run, and so it's not just the sample bias. Now it's the sample collection techniques, how it gets done. So here we have, they start off with a little anecdote, Austrian ski town of, and I'm not even going to try that, Iskil, I think is how it's pronounced, it was one of the first super spreader events in a ski area. but they were kind of at the vanguard of actually looking at wastewater sampling to track this outbreak there. So it was what they call a super spreader event. A bunch of people went there. They all got sick. They spread it around to each other, and it was one of the very first in March of 2020. So. And as they go on to say here, wastewater monitoring has been used to track polio and other pathogens for decades. But the COVID stuff really got a lot of interest in this, and people have dived into that. But it definitely is a technique, as Dirk mentioned, a technique that really needs to be refined. Um, so this kind of goes on to describe the technique takes advantage of the fact that the SARS CoV two replicates in the digestive system and is shed in high quantities, often before symptoms appear. So what will happen is you're going to get asymptotic people and symptomatic people all showing up in the wastewater. The wastewater is going to represent sort of a community average is really what it's supposed to represent. So it's in theory an inexpensive way to monitor the infections of people that are their sewage is coming into the this particular wastewater system, so they can actually do genetic sequencing on the vaccine, which is the only way to tell if you have a variant or not, and they can see what variants are prevalent. So in theory, it sounds really good, relatively inexpensive, and a quick way to collect samples. But there are some caveats. They talk here about how they've made an uptick on these things, but here's the caveat here. Still, the jury is out on just how useful the technology is. So now we're going to dive into the details. Reliably determining viral levels in wastewater has some logistical and technical challenges. Interpreting the data, as we've been talking about, can be difficult. And they have just one example. A good downpour can send virus concentrations in sewers plummeting because you're diluting the effect. So if the sewers, and a lot of sewers are leaky, that you get a heavy downpour, that water is going to flow into the sewers. You're going to get dilution. So that's going to affect your data as well, and that's only one problem. So collection, testing, reporting systems can be time consuming and expensive. And one thing here says, they're having a struggle to convince policymakers that the data is useful. So getting the funding to perfect this. But one thing I wanted to talk about here too. So in theory, in this paragraph here, wastewater testing is straightforward, like standard clinical tests. It uses a polymerase chain reaction or PCR assay to search for specific snippets of viral RNA in a sample, which are then copied repeatedly to amplify the signal. Now, we all know, or most of us know, that the PCR testing really is a flawed technique when it comes to COVID. So it has some issues, and the CDC is actually de-emphasizing PCR testing. It has to do with the number of cycles they run the test through, and so if you run it through enough cycles, you're going to get something no matter what. So it's really kind of a flawed test. And so there is some caveats, which is the actual PCR test itself. So these are some challenges here. So also, it mentions here where a throat or nose swab contains the same amount of material from person to person. They're roughly the same. Wastewater samples contain different amounts of feces depending on the day and time the sample's taken, recent rainfall, whether the toilet's upstream or in homes, offices, or other buildings. There's daily variations, morning, evening, nighttime. So these are all variables that are hard to figure out. So anyway, the whole And you can see here's some some data that indicates in the Netherlands you can see some of the how things show up in wastewater. Once again, this is kind of an average, so you can see the Omicron surge here and some of the other surges that we've had, and so on the surface it appears to be useful. There are some caveats. So once again, the data is needs to be taken with a grain of salt. We need to be a little careful. And so they go on, they talk a little bit about more, some of the caveats in the data here and um, that they're talking about here that with the Omicron wave, they call it whatever, that the wastewater has provided some backstop to, confirm the testing of individuals as well. So you got different data sets you can compare, and you can kind of get some useful information out of that. So, and talking about standardization, um, sequencing water samples, is can be challenging. So they go on and talk about a lot of stuff here. I think we covered the basics here on that. You can look at this article. This is in Science. Let me scroll back up to the top here. Sorry to make you dizzy as we go back up here. This is dated March 9th. And so in Science, so you can look at that if you're interested in a lot more detail. So that's my thoughts on using wastewater for the COVID testing. I really think it's something that probably has some use. It could be useful in other when other viruses come around, and they will, is tracking these things. We need to improve the technique, and you need to understand the weaknesses and the data gaps and just the caveats that we have in the sample collection and those things, and not just read the headlines that are based on this, because headlines tend to be sensationalized and people react to those things, which is the whole idea. They sell newspapers or get people to look at their online articles, and that's all well and good for them, but you got to be careful anytime you're collecting these massive amounts of data, is understand what really goes into it. So hopefully I've given you a little idea of the pros and cons of using this particular method. Okay, on to different stuff here. Here's an article I thought was a little interesting, why some foods have larger water footprints than others. This is kind of written from a green perspective, so you have to understand the bias in this too. I mean, everything out there is biased. It's important when you read these things, these articles, to really understand what the bias is that's involved in these things. So you're going to see a little bit of spin on this, but if you read through that, if you ignore the spin on things, it is actually kind of interesting information, and just knowing, just your water planning, you can really dial in on things if. We're going to talk about how certain things, how agricultural crops and meat crops all have different water uses, and how they're broken out, and really how that plans in California, where they're doing the basin planning. What are your inputs and outputs? How much does agriculture use? Because agriculture is important, but can we adjust things so they use less water when you have droughts? That's not an easy thing to do. So anyway, this article's got some interesting things. They break the water footprint out into three areas here. They have the blue water footprint, which is the amount of surface water and groundwater required to produce an item, and that includes evaporated or used directly. So for food, this mainly refers to crop irrigation. You're going to have some evaporative loss, and then you're going to have direct use. So it's important to understand the evaporative loss. In some places, really desert areas like what most of California is, evaporative loss can be fairly high. Your green water footprint, they break out, is the amount of rainwater required to make an item. So So this for this article, for food, this refers to how much rainwater crops receive and how much the soil retains. So a little bit distinction from irrigation, and then your gray water footprint. So the amount of fresh water required to dilute wastewater. So um, for food, this refers to things like field and farm runoff and wastewater generated in processing. So for things like feedlots, for instance, you're going to have some wastewater treatment, high nitrates and stuff. So we're seeing some wastewater treatment there, and so there's going to be other situations where there's actually gray water situations, and that constitutes a use of water. So three areas, an interesting concept. Three areas that these things are really broken out into. Um, um, so they say food crops planted in areas that receive adequate rainfall for agricultural will have a larger green water footprint, where crops planted in drier areas that require irrigation will have a larger blue water footprint. Makes sense. Um, so they're saying that food crops with higher green water footprint are generally less of a problem unless there's a drought. So kind of a green spin on things there. Um, and food crops suffering under drought are often irrigated water resources that are needed elsewhere for residential uses and healthy ecosystems. I might dispute that and say that what's more important than food, but obviously we have to have water to drink too. So there needs to be a balance there. So it's not just we're going to cut off all the crops and people are going to starve. So there needs to be a balance in that. So a little bit of spin there on that. So you need to take that into account. So anyhow, let's look at foods with the largest and smallest water footprints. Large full water footprint, they say, is crops that take more than 75 gallons of water per unit. Medium water footprint, 20 gallons to 75 gallons of water. Smaller water footprint, less than 20 gallons of water. So meat tends to have a larger water footprint than many plant-based food items, um, as well as dairy and eggs, uh, because actually, cattle, chickens all need to drink water. There's going to be some wastewater involved, and usually, probably not for meat. Rainfall is not going to be a big deal, so they consider it a little more problematic because you're using produced water for that. So they consider it an irrigated function. Um, so meat is one of the larger water footprints out there. Um, there are food crops out there, plants, nuts, and some dried fruits are in the large category. Some people say that almonds, for instance, it takes 1 gallon of water to produce one almond. That's what I hear. I've never seen the actual data behind that, but that's the commonly bandied around number. So you look at an almond tree, and that would put that into the large category for them. Medium water footprints. I guess I was mistaken earlier. Dairy, eggs, beans, many fruits, and a bunch of different processed foods are in this category. Um, uh, Producing protein takes water, obviously. That's why a lot of these things fall in the medium to large. Um, they're what they call pulses. I missed that definition, but for beef, the water footprint per gram of protein is 6 times larger than for pulses. And the small water footprint includes most of the veggies out there, especially root vegetables, because they get their water directly from the soil, some irrigation, especially if it's dry. And so most of those they consider in the lower categories. So now the rest of this article, they're putting their green spin on how you should change your eating habits and stuff like that. But So the important part for us is that different foods take different water footprints. If you're producing these crops, you need to plan for that, and in areas that have water shortages, maybe it's good to shift your crops towards that are drought prone. For instance, maybe it's good to shift your crops towards something that's less water intensive. So that's kind of what I get out of this, and not so much changing your dietary habits, because I'm sorry, I'm not gonna quit eating meat. So there you go. So that's that. Another article I thought was interesting was on the remediation front. Micropollutants are a big deal. They're hard to get out of water to remediate. So MIT News has an article on using soap, which is surfactant, to remove micropollutants from water. And of course, the question is, how do you get the soap out once it's when we're talking about soap, we're not thinking about Ivory Spring or Irish Spring or Ivory bar of soap. It's actually considered to be a surfactant. But it's going to take the hydrophobic micropollutant. It's going to float it out. You're going to be separate that off, and you're going to be able to actually get some reduction. How practical this is going to be on a large scale basis, it remains to be seen. But the research is really is interesting to me. Is a lot of these micropollutants are water phobic, which means they're going to be suspended in water, but they're not going to be actually dissolved in the water. Which a hydrophobic pollutant is going to be a little bit easier to get out, because it's going to come right out if you have some technique like this surfactant that's going to allow it to lift it out of the water and allow you to separate it. So it's so it's kind of an interesting article here, that we're seeing some of these different techniques, and I'm not going to dive into this too much. They are talking about scaling this up a little bit, and doing some larger scale bench scale tests, and then some larger scale tests from there to see if this might actually work. So they do have a grant for studying this. It's To me, it's interesting that the research continues into these techniques, and we're diving into things like micropollutants that aren't typically things we think of, but they can have toxic effects in groundwater in certain circumstances. So it's interesting that we're looking at these particular techniques here. So let me hold on a minute, move this a little bit. All right, so now on to some California news. California is still in the midst of a drought again. They're not in really severe drought, but definitely drought conditions. So this first article is the Department of Water Resources in California is providing $49 million in funding for 18 projects across the state for drought relief. There, excuse me, cough. I didn't have time to hit the cough button. My apologies. Um, so there's 15 that directly support disadvantaged communities. So back once again, we see a lot of this funding going to disadvantaged communities and tribal infrastructure. They're talking about infrastructure repairs, well rehabilitation, hauled water projects to affect for these communities affected by the drought. So we see as we move into the third year that we're really seeing some of these issues here. And hold on just a minute here. All right. Got the sound back. Sorry about that. That mute button was not being cooperative. All right. So there's some funding available for that. Also, Northern California is going to get some more snow and rain, but probably not going to affect the drought. So we're seeing a storm system move in, uh, followed by a stronger system. And so that's going to help with the snowpack. But at this point, probably too little, too late. They had some really big snows beginning of the year, then a big gap, and so we're seeing some gaps there. But um, our so the year started off good in Northern California, but did not improve substantially, and we're seeing some late spring snowstorms coming in. It'll help a little bit, but probably not all that much. So, and speaking of California news, we're going to kind of wrap things up here. If you are in California, you're interested in California water, one thing you should not miss is Mavens Notebook, which is mavensnotebook.com. This is Chris Austin, and she does a yeoman's job, really an amazing job in pulling together the water news. If you don't subscribe to this, you should. You should probably pitch in a few bucks to donate to keep this up, because she really does an amazing job in keeping track of water news in California, what's going on with the regulatory agencies, and pretty much anything that has to do with California water. So just for instance, let's look at her daily digest for today. So she puts these up every day, or every weekday actually. So she's got her calendar first. So upcoming meetings, webinars, workshops, and that's all coming up. So you can see there's Sacramento River temperature management considerations workshop. So if you're interested in that, California Water Commission, a webinar in California, the Colorado River, advances environmental monitoring, water sensors, webinar, some other webinars here, and even down to the Groundwater Resource Association of California Sacramento branch meeting. Patterns of radon activity in California groundwater. So she covers this stuff really well. And so we can go through and see what she's got in the news today. And this is just kind of a quick snapshot. She's got the links so you can dive into these a little deeper if you want to, but she provides a quick snapshot so you can just go through here and get an idea of what's going on with water news in California. So here we have Judge OK's plan for California water projects, pending review of Trump area policies, and just so a lot of these things get tied up in court. So here's the link if you want to read more about that. California's used more water as state braces for another dry year. So the salient point here is California water. They're, as the drought drags on, people are less willing to sacrifice. So water usage in California is creeping up 2.6%, and we're still in a drought. So no mandatory restrictions on water at this point, but if as water use continues to creep up and they stay in the drought, you may see some of that stuff. So in California's Central Valley, drought is a growing threat to farms, food, and people, as we know, and certainly with crops. We talked about that a little bit. Certain water uses out there, and unfortunately, they do grow a lot of almonds out there, so water-intensive crops. So there really needs to be a balance, but certainly the drought is threatening farms and agricultural production, and this really affects us with the war in the Ukraine, and we're seeing a lot of countries being affected by droughts and pulling back in their own agricultural crops. We're seeing a lot fewer exports, so this is actually a big deal. A lot of times you can make up things by exports on agriculture, but since we're seeing a lot of stuff in the world where a lot of these exports are being curtailed, we could see some significant food shortages coming up later this year and extending into next year. Fertilizer shortage is another big deal that we're not talking about because we're talking about water, but these are all things that affect the crops. So this is a big deal. So that's stuff to pay attention to. We're going to see some Department of Water Resources regulatory actions for the drought. Here's a drought status update. As you can see, Nevada's really getting hit hard. They got the severe drought conditions. Most of California is in a drought, but not the ultra severe drought that Nevada is seeing. So here's our story on the Northern California water storms coming in, aircraft cloud seeding. See if that helps. Definition of drought. You can see there's a lot of stories here. I mean, she really covers a lot of stuff here. There's some commentary. She even pulls up commentary on different things. So here's commentary from Congressman Doug LaMalfa from the Redding area, combating California's water crisis. And Doug LaMalfa always writes interesting stuff. That's worth checking out. So, and then her featured article here. Regional water news. She breaks it down. So you can see this is really just, and I'm not going to go through all this, but you can see she puts a lot of work here. I send her some money every month just because I think it's worthwhile to support this. I would urge you at least to subscribe, and if you see value in it, to send her some money because she does really an amazing job. I mean, she's got some other stuff on here besides the water news. She's got some data, some resources. Actually, the whole Delta thing. She's got agency contacts. She dives into the different meetings and the latest posts in her main. So a calendar of upcoming events. So you can see there's a lot of good information there. So I highly recommend that if you're interested at all in California water news, that you subscribe to Mavens Notebook, and if you can pitch her some money, even $5-10 a month really helps support all this, and it all helps. Okay, that's our wrap up on some select water news and my what I call my pithy commentary. So so I certainly have my opinions that I'm going to share with you. So I appreciate you watching. If you so let's kind of get wrapped up here, and I got a few classes coming up I wanted to talk about. So coming up, we have the well health check process for diagnosing well problems. This is a 1-hour class we're having on March 29th. That's going to be from 9 to 10 Pacific time. And registration details are on my events page on LinkedIn. You can just look in my LinkedIn profile that I'll present here in a little bit. Coming up in April, we have systematic well management class, optimizing performance at every stage of a well's life. This is going to be a 6-hour class. We're going to have that from April 5th to 7th, and that's going to be a 6-hour class spread over 3 days. So we're going to do 2 hours a day from 8 to 10 Pacific time. This format worked really well the last time I ran this class. It's primarily designed for water system operators. And so by doing it 2 hours a day for 3 days in a row, from 8 to 10, they can get the class, they can hit the class, get done at 10 o'clock and still get out and do their work. And so I'm trying this format again because I got a lot of kudos on doing it in that format. So that's going to be coming up, and once again, the details, and I'll present more details here later. But the details for that are on my LinkedIn events page. So you can find out where to sign up for that and go from there. I'll be sending out an email blast as well. So there we go. We do this show every week from basically 9 o'clock Pacific time. 11 o'clock Central Time. If you want to contact me with any ideas, you want to come on the show, I'll show you how to do that in a minute. You can contact me at tballard@groundwaterguy.com. That's my email address, and that'll get you right to me. I'll respond to your email. Always interested in hearing from folks, even if it's just questions and comments. Do this better, comb your hair, whatever. I want to hear it. So, okay. So, streaming channels, Groundwater Guy, a YouTube channel. You can just look that up. There's a long URL for that, but you can just look up Groundwater Guy YouTube channel. All our past shows are on there as well, so you can go back and look at that. We have a variety of things. We talk about news. We got some interviews that are interesting. We teach some mini courses actually from week to week on different topics. So that's all interesting. That's all there on the Groundwater Guy YouTube channel, and then we stream into there every Thursday. I also stream into LinkedIn. There on my profile, you can find my events page and see us there on LinkedIn, and this will be posted up there when we're done there too. So. If you want to be a guest on Groundwater Talk Live, here is my the URL for that. Let me fix that as it scrolled off the page. I don't know what happened there, but I must have moved it by accident. But here's the URL for that. Or you can just get a hold of me by email. That might be a little bit easier. But I have my show up there. Ned's still hiding. He hasn't come on the show yet, so he's busy right now. But he promises he's going to come on because, speaking of pithy commentary, Ned puts me to shame. So we're going to get him on the show. I'm not going to let him off the hook. So Dirk, we're gonna get him on the show. So all right. So all right. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. That really helps me get the word out. There's an alarm bell on there. You can click that, and that'll let you know when we got new shows up there. This will be up there immediately. I kind of edit it down and add some descriptions and stuff on it. But that's the Groundwater Guy YouTube channel. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I showed you the link earlier. So thanks so much for watching. I appreciate all of you, and we will see you next week. Same bat time, same bat station.